We're in the Pacific Theater of World War II, Part 2. And World War II, we're going to be talking about the years 1941 to 1945. So we kind of went over in the last video talking about the attack of Pearl Harbor and America entering the war, onto the attack of Japan bombing and attacking the Philippines and Wake Island and Guam Island and taking those areas over. Japan going in, overcoming Singapore and Hong Kong. So Japan looks like it has victorious in the Pacific Ocean area, plus onto taking over China. So the Japanese had made a compact to be in the Axis powers along with Hitler and Mussolini. So let's whiz through this part here. So the initial Japanese successes, like I said, they took Wake and Guam, the Philippines, Manila Harbor, and then we had the ugly Bataan March of 10,000 American soldiers that were killed in the midst of all of this. And then on to the British losses and the Battle of the Java Sea in the East Indies. All of these were Japanese successes during the war, looking pretty bleak for the Allies, pretty bleak for America. So here we have Pearl Harbor onto Wake and Guam, and 450 U.S. soldiers on Wake Island, heroically holding off the Japanese. Here we have General Douglas MacArthur, who was stationed in the Philippines and trying to hold them back, but losing his 250 aircraft carriers and his fleet or aircraft, not carriers, but aircraft. So losing these things and basically having to leave the Philippines, but saying, I will return. On to Manila and Luzon, and you see the devastation there. And General MacArthur basically gone now. They had to defend themselves, ending up not having supplies, having to surrender. At Bataan, you see here, this is actually a memorial here, as General MacArthur said, I will return. And he did. We'll find that he did return. This is the Bataan Death March. Americans being killed as they marched 70 miles, and if they were sick or ill or wounded or tired, they would kill them along the way. And so there were many Americans, their bodies laying aside along the road of the Bataan Death March. And of course they were starved and worked almost to death. So losing so many, over half of the American soldiers there died. On to the British losses of Hong Kong and Singapore, where they thought Singapore was impregnable. Singapore was lost to the Japanese. In the East Indies, we have this Battle of the Java Sea that was fought on February 1942, and American and Dutch vessels were sunk, and the Japanese were victorious in this area. And they went on to try to overtake India and on to try to overtake Australia. But the first American victories, and that's where we're really going to begin with this part 2, were, can you believe, in Tokyo. We talked about the Doolittle raid, as these 16 American B-25 bombers came in secretly, snuck into the land of the sea of the Pacific Ocean there, the Sea of Japan, and over Tokyo. Tokyo was basically Japan's capital, with the most people living there, most people in the world, actually, one of the biggest cities in the world. And so as Doolittle brings in just these 16 American, he comes in and he bombs these cities over Tokyo, and he retreats. Of course, the Japanese army after him, aircraft after him. After them, they ended up coming into China. As you can see, their flight, as they as they come in, they came from the aircraft carrier, and basically some of them going this way, and as we go this way, and retreating into China here, and they're fighting and being victorious. Here's the group. You know, many of them survived this. It was quite a raid. So this really got Americans excited that they finally were winning. They finally had a victory, and thought they were going to win this war. The Coral Sea. In their move against Australia, Japanese are moving against Australia now. The Japanese plan to seize all of New Guinea, Papua New Guinea, New Guinea. Here's the island, and here's Australia down here, and here's New Guinea, Papua New Guinea, and this whole island's called New Guinea. And so they also wanted to seize the British Solomon Islands, which are right here, and onto the Bismarck Archipelago and the Solomon, all of this whole area here. Actually, here's the Coral Sea right here. Here's where the battle would take place. They were stopped in May of 1942 by the U.S. ships and aircraft. So during the Battle of the Coral Sea, this is the first naval battle in the history in which the opposing vessels did not even sight one another. They didn't see one another. They were going by their radar forces to see where they were. And the Japanese lost 2 aircraft carriers, a cruiser, and many aircrafts. They just abandoned. So this is a victory, the Coral Sea. Even if you go there, you can go snorkeling underneath this Coral Sea, and you'll see a lot of these Japanese military ships clear at the bottom of the ocean there. The Battle of the Coral Sea, right here with next to New Guinea and Australia. Japan has their eyes now set on conquering Australia. Midway. This was another victory for the United States. So here, the tide's turning now. Japanese swept ahead in the North Pacific towards Midway and the Hawaiian Islands with the huge striking force of more than 100 ships. The Americans could muster only about half that number of ships. But at the crucial Battle of Midway in June 1942, the U.S. broke the back of the Japanese fleet. Despite heavy bombing of Midway and the sinking of the damaged Yorktown, U.S. airmen caught the Japanese off guard and sank 4 Japanese heavy carriers, aircraft carriers, as well as a heavy cruiser. With the loss of the carrier force, the tide of the war was turning. The Americans were winning in sinking some of their major aircraft carriers. You can see a picture here of one going down here in the American Battle of Midway. Very important. There have been many movies. There's a few movies made on Midway. The Aleutian Islands, for goodness sakes. The Aleutian Islands are up in Alaska. So Japan decides to attack Alaska. So the Japanese launched a diversion towards Alaska so that we'd be diverted. We're focusing in the Pacific, in the South Pacific. And now all of a sudden, Alaska being attacked. After bombing the Dutch harbor in Alaska, they occupied Attu, Kiska, and Agatu in the Aleutian Islands. So they're in the Aleutian Islands, right close to our country. You can imagine along the Pacific coast there of California and Oregon and Washington, they're all now moving their forces in, thinking that Japan possibly could be attacking our western coast there. So, but Alaska, excuse me, but Alaska is the only territory in North America that was invaded by the Axis powers. Japan would never attack. If you go to San Francisco bunkers, you can see where the bunkers were ready for the Japanese to come in and attack San Francisco. In May 1943, American troops destroyed the Japanese force on Attu, and 3 months later, the Japanese withdrew without a fight from Alaska. Can you believe they would even try to divert us to Alaska, you know? So, back down to the Pacific in the Guadalcanal. And August 7th of 1942 marked the beginning of the Allied counteroffensives in the South Pacific. The United States Marines went ashore on Guadalcanal and the other islands, and this is in the Solomon Islands. As we have Australia, we have New Guinea here. Remember I told you the Solomon Islands are down this way. So, and Guadalcanal is here. So, the first task was to gain control of the new Japanese airship and later the Henderson Field in honor of the heroic Marine aviator. So basically there was a field there and Air Force field, and wanted to gain control as Japan had come in and overtaken that area. The Japanese landed heavy reinforcements to regain control. The struggle lasted until February of 1943. The Marines and Army troops fought not only against the fanatical Japanese Banzai attacks, but also against insects and malaria and diseases of the jungle, other diseases of the jungle. So they were fighting, Americans are fighting in the jungle, as you can see these pictures. The Americans overcame the Japanese resistance and succeeded in recovering the island base. So you can imagine this is jungle area here, and Americans are fighting in that, in the midst of all that, and bringing in, actually Guadalcanal is considered an American victory, but there was a lot. You can see this, like this picture here and there. You can see how the environment of the jungle would be a harsh environment to fight, and to see this tank in the midst of the jungle. The road to Japan. So the Allies, you know, that's us, adopted a strategy of island hopping. So what was island hopping? Well, basically we would pick the most important islands and we would put our bases there, establish our air bases there, so that we keep driving each island as we got closer and closer to Japan. Island hopping strategy. General McCarthy engaged in dislodging the Japanese from New Guinea. So when you think of General MacArthur, you know how brave he was and what a man he was, you know, but him actually dislodging, you know, coming in to New Guinea and protecting Australia. See, Japan, if they got New Guinea, they thought that'd be easy place for them to stage a war against Australia. So Admiral William Halsey fought to take over the Solomon Islands. And Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, concentrated hid forces in the Central Pacific to crack the Japanese Empire. So you see here, these admirals here, we have MacArthur's War in the Jungle, right? A picture of Japan looking for the island hopping towards Japan. And then we have these generals, Nimitz and Halsey, fighting to take over the Solomon Islands. Fighting deadly diseases. Okay, not only that, deadly animals. As you can see here, we have sharks and alligators and mosquitoes, right? So the soldiers had to fight in murky swamps and dense jungles and on sharp coral reefs. You can imagine they were not, our American soldiers were not used to swamps like these. And insects of all kinds were there. And there were dangerous tropical diseases, especially malaria. Along the beaches and lagoons, soldiers had to be wary of crocodiles and sharks. Here's a picture of one of the big attacks, shark attacks, and you have this wounded soldier there, and of course the sharks are looking on at smelling the wound there and attacking a lot of those that were in the water, you know, that were wounded in the water. And one big problem was, the biggest problem was the Japanese absolutely refused to surrender. They would have suicide attempts, you know, they're kamikazes, you know, they felt if they surrendered, you know, if they surrendered, they would not basically in their next life, as most of them were Buddhists thinking of reincarnation, so they would rather die. So they believed it was their sacred duty to defend their homeland to the death. To surrender would bring the ultimate dishonor. They would keep fighting even when there was no hope for victory. The Japanese would keep fighting. And many rather commit suicide than surrender. So very few prisoners were taken because when the American won when they were defeated in battle, they basically committed suicide. It's terrible. I like some of these pictures here because the Japanese, they call it the cacophony of hell. The story of the Ramir Island, the crocodile massacre, came in and attacked a lot of the Japanese there. Of course, we have Skeeter Beater, the malaria control unit that was there. And of course, we have their picture, we have the shark attack. Island hopping strategy was very successful. And this is a picture of the island hopping. So basically you can see how Guadalcanal, onto Midway, and as we get to the Philippines, we get close to Iwo Jima, and on to Japan, how we would try to get to the closer islands to attack the Japanese there. You can see pictures. This is you can see here, this is Japan and China. This is down into Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and Australia is here at the bottom. You can see better in this picture. Australia onto, onto this French Indochina here, which now is like Vietnam and Laos and Thailand and all this area now. So in the Dutch West Indies here, down to Australia. Led by Douglas MacArthur, the United States began a campaign of island hopping. So the Gilbert Islands. The first step in island hopping was to capture Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands. So the Americans would have an air base there from which they could bomb Japanese positions in the Marshalls and the Caroline Islands. So we thought we had overcome into the Gilbert Islands. Admiral Nimitz ships and planes heavily bombed the islands. The Marshalls and Caroline Islands. When the Marines landed, they were forced to fight the fanatical Japanese to the last man. 4,800 enemy troops and civilian workers were there, and only 147 were taken alive. So, in the midst of all that, basically the devastation there was quite amazing, as a lot of them committed suicide. I talked to a guy that I led to the Lord back when, Warren, he was on one of these days. He said, as we came in, the people committed suicide rather than be taken by the United States, because the Japanese had told them that they would torture them. And so they all jumped off cliffs and committed suicide. Very terrible. The Marianas, the major showdown. In June and July of 1944, was the assault upon the keystone of Japanese defense, Saipan in the Mariana Islands. The Marianas and the United States troops, the Marines and the United States troops landed on June 15th. So, and the fighting ended in July with the last groups of Japanese soldiers making suicide attempts into the teeth of the American machine gun fire. They were basically just flying their planes and crashing them into our machine guns. The Japanese Navy made a desperate attempt to stop the invasion of Saipan. But in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Japanese lost 4 aircraft carriers and 400 planes. The American forces seized Guam and Tinian in July and possessed the Marianas. This huge B-29 super fortress of bombers began to make daily raids upon the Japanese cities from their bases in the Marianas. Japan's war production centers were totally destroyed. So this is a major showdown for Japan. Japan is losing a lot of their soldiers and equipment. On to New Guinea. In the summer of 1942, General Douglas MacArthur established a base at Port Moresby in southeastern Papua New Guinea. His forces began the slow, arduous campaign to drive the Japanese out of New Guinea. Remember, the Japanese really wanted New Guinea to be their center so that they could invade Australia. So this would remove the threat to Australia. It was a difficult supplying the troops in the jungles with food, medicine, and ammunition. You can imagine. I've been to Papua New Guinea, and there's large mountains there, and a lot of different villages that you can't get to on foot very well at all, only by plane. So, despite tropical diseases, fierce heat and humidity, and intense Japanese resistance, the Allies pushed back and won the war of supply. So basically, Douglas MacArthur just being continually going forward there throughout 1943 and 1944, MacArthur's forces took the key enemy positions and isolated the Japanese garrisons. In the fall of 1944, MacArthur was striking distance of the Philippines. So basically, MacArthur was says, we got to keep Papua New Guinea. We have to be in New Guinea. I love these pictures, don't you? Because I've been there before, but I love how, this native is walking a soldier that has been hurt through the jungles, and you see these Papua New Guineans fighting on the side of Americans. It was and the Australians, Americans, and New Guineans all fighting together against the Japanese invading forces. Return to the Philippines. Remember what General MacArthur said? I will return. He's going to return to the Philippines. Remember, the Philippines now have controlled, and they took over, the troops there and put our soldiers through that deadly death march and the Bataan Death March. Now we have Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet launching airstrikes against both the Central Philippines and Luzon. They would eliminate many Japanese ships and planes along the way. The Allied forces landed on Pilio Island and Morotai Island, west and south of the Mindanao, and provided the airfields in Indonesia. So this is all in Indonesia. So the Allied forces were going in. These successes led General MacArthur and Admiral Halsey to change plans and to decide to land on the eastern side of Leyte Island. So we have here, so we see General MacArthur said, I will return to the Philippines. He loved the Philippines. In fact, he said, give me 10,000 Filipinos and I shall conquer the world. The Battle of Leyte Gulf. After the daring carrier raids on Japanese air bases in Formosa and Okinawa, American troops landed on the eastern beaches of Leyte in October in 1944. General MacArthur made good his promise to return to the Philippines. The Japanese Navy made a final desperate attempt to stop the invasion and organize their entire fleet into 3 separate striking forces. The resulting Battle of the Gulf there, one of the greatest battles in history, is the Battle of the Leyte Gulf. The Japanese lost almost all of their remaining ships and planes at this point. Here's a picture, as you see here, of areas under Japanese control at this time. And we're talking about 1942, the Allies and neutral nations. And you can see this fighting going on where, again, we have, here's Japan, here's China over here, here's the Philippines, the battling the Philippines down to New Guinea there, and the Borneo, Thailand, all these areas. And you can see all these areas were under Japanese control at this time. And one by one, America fought these battles to basically drive Japan back. And so we see the battles of Okinawa, Iwo Jima, Saipan, and going on here. So that's it for now.